started with First Draft News about a week before the 2016 election. And my whole goal was to support democracy, which supports a free press. And so it was really great to be able to work with these other organizations who also have the same motivations, the same ambitions. It made Tuesdays, we had a Tuesday call where we called each other up and learned what everybody was doing so that we wouldn't overlap and duplicate, and so that journalists and the public weren't confused about who to go to for what. So we worked with the American Press Institute, Election SOS, First Draft, the organization I work for, Hearken, PEN America, Protect Democracy, and Trusting News. And you'll hear from all of them about their initiatives in 2020. First up is API's John Hernandez.
Hey everybody, I'm going to share my screen real quick. Give me 2 seconds to pull that up. Share screen. Share. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, looks great.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did this year with our Trusted Elections Network at API, mostly focusing on explaining democracy and government and civic processes and making sure that's accessible in our reporting. The first thing I'll say is that, we identified early on that TED needed to focus on explanatory reporting about voting and election administration to connect audiences to politics. We had to, this year made us rewrite the playbook. The pandemic prompted rapid, confusing changes to the process of voting in many states. More voters choose to vote by mail than ever before. The primaries earlier in the year featured a lot of high rejection and error rates across the country for mail ballots. But then we saw that those rejection rates actually declined when people voted in the general. So obviously something changed. What changed was that we started to center audience needs in our reporting. A few key things here. Working in the name of democracy and civics meant journalists were a part of the big public education effort that was required in order to make sure that people could vote. For those that weren't aware, a Pew Research survey from August said around 55% of those surveyed anticipating that they would have difficulties voting. You can see in the graph that I have pulled up right there, it's from a night report that from last week, that confidence in where and how to vote increased from 79% before the election to 85% after the election. So definitely credit the hard work of election officials on that front. Where would we be without them? But also credit journalists who threw out their previous assumptions about how to report on the elections and focus on the obvious need in front of them. So what did that look like? Once we identified the importance of explanatory reporting, we ran a microgrant program to fund projects that did just that. We have important lessons coming in from these grants right now. The first example on the left is from Enlace Latino in North Carolina. It's a Latino news media outlet. Basically they provided their audiences the kitchen sink. They wrote stories, created infographics, organized virtual town hall events, released an elections podcast, and produced videos. This expanded their reach in a year when it was really difficult to achieve the normal reach that you would get when you could actually meet in person. The Philadelphia Inquirer's political team created a thorough voting FAQ that was informed by audience questions, and then their grant funding actually helped to translate it into Spanish, into Chinese and Vietnamese, the next most spoken languages in the Philadelphia area. They developed a pretty comprehensive workflow for translating projects that also established relationships with translators and community partners that they would use going forward. And then finally, the Detroit Free Press offered explainers on how to vote in video format. Again, expanding the reach and considering how to make things accessible, especially off platform. They shared those on YouTube and social media. We have a variety of other examples. We end up funding a total of 36 projects, but what we saw was a lot of people moving out of their comfort zone in order to make sure that they could reach the most amount of people in a difficult year when the pandemic and obviously the racial reckoning this summer were capturing a lot of people's attention. So what does this mean for us next? It's our belief that we need to keep explaining civics, democracy, and voting. What do election officials do between elections? They run or prepare for other elections. The next big elections aren't in 2022. They're happening all over the place in the coming months. And you can see that a lot of major cities are having mayoral elections. We have gubernatorial and legislative elections in New Jersey and Virginia. We also have redistricting next year. which, how does that work? Most people, I imagine, are not necessarily aware that it also has policy implications for the following decade. And how do those policy outcomes affect our audiences? There's a lot of material here to break up that 2-year or 4-year cycle of elections reporting when we actually have democracy and civics going on all the time that we could work on and explain to our audiences. So I'll wrap it up there. If you're interested in doing more of this work, please stay in touch with us, chat with us in the breakout room, come to our event on Thursday, where we'll discuss more of the findings from our grant projects with journalists from Enlace, the Inquirer, the Detroit Free Press, and more. Or send us an email and let us know you want to do more of this and want to be connected to our future work on this front. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Amy again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Nell, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slides. Thank you. So our team did a lot of work this year. We were lucky enough we went from a staff of 3 to about 14 in our New York bureau, and we were all committed. What we said in the beginning of the year, we'll cover everything: hurricanes, unfortunately, mass shootings, things like that. Never did we think that it would also include a pandemic, but I think we've all been served up a lot of surprises and have pivoted accordingly. So we have an investigative research team of 8 who share insights on Slack and First Draft Update. We have 3 team members looking specifically at disinformation targeting Black and Latinx communities, and they would connect with civic organizations that relayed their findings to them so that those audiences were better prepared for things that they might see online. We have 5 fellows supporting newsrooms, whether it was training or local insights in Colorado, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. We also had 50 students that powered our U.S. student network. They were Diara's Army, as I like to call them. They were 50 students who were trained to monitor, verify, and report on disinformation. They shared those tips with journalists and other people on our Slack community. We have a daily insights dashboard, which we continue to update with snapshots from our team. We also had a weekly webinar where people in our network could come and ask us questions, and a weekly training newsletter that goes out on Thursdays that will continue in 2021. But the thing I think that we were most happy with, the thing that we took away from, Nell, if you could, the next slide. That we trained more than 1,000 journalists and community leaders, and we did 15 in-person trainings across the US. So we divvied up our team. They went all to the places that you see on the right-hand column. I was lucky enough to go to the Detroit, Missouri, and El Paso legs. And what it has taught me, I've been with First Draft since 2016. We did a French election project. We did a Brazilian election project, and this election project. And there is just no substitute for in-person training. That's where you really make connections with people. That's where you can convince them to join your Slack community and to sign up for your newsletters and to stay connected. It's also great to hear firsthand what journalists on the ground are wrestling with. It was amazing to hear people from TV, small TV broadcasters sort of complain about like what they are allowed to report on, what they're not able to report on. It's just great. I think it informs our trainings well in terms of not giving them things that are completely out of scope with what they're able to actually do in the newsroom. So that's Nella, for the next slide, please. So that's what we think the in-person training builds trust. The journalists need training, and news leaders who resource and support for this training at every level in a newsroom. It's not just a verification reporter or a social media journalist, it's everybody down to the headline writer, which can be really critical with news output. So we were very lucky to be well funded. Knight Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, and Omidyar, among others, who really powered this work. It takes funding to travel, and it takes people to power those trainings. So we are super appreciative to be able to have done that work, and we'll continue to do it in some form or fashion in 2021. Once everybody was moved to online, we then pivoted to online trainings and did crisis simulations. So that was a lot of fun. So I will turn it over next to Bridget, who is with Hearken and also worked with Joy on Election SOS.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all for being here today, and also thank you for the work you do. I spent most of this year working with over 100 journalists on really deep sort of strategic planning for their election coverage as related to engagement specifically. And I was honestly blown away by the dedication, the creativity, and the just grit that journalists have shown this year to continue to produce really resonant, relevant reporting while dealing with everything that we all are dealing with. So first, I just want to thank you for the work that you've done. They are continuing to do. The fact that you showed up for this call today shows that you're continuing to invest in building that muscle. And I hope as we enter the end of the year that you have the chance to reflect and really celebrate everything you were able to accomplish. So Election SOS is a collaborative initiative, which was housed by Hearken, which is where I work as an engagement manager. And it's really the story of identifying a need for election coverage that would respond to critical community information needs, right? We've been talking long before 2020 arrived about the need for election coverage this year to be different. We didn't know how different this year was going to be until it came here. So Election SOS, as I mentioned, is housed by Hearken, but really so many of the organizations on today's call were deep supporters and participants, and many others as well. And our goal was really a two-phase strategy. Phase one was proactive planning, right? We wanted to provide training to over 500 journalists, which we did, on creating, again, election coverage that surfaces community critical information needs. Phase two, which we entered just a few months before the election, is really reactive response, right? What do journalists need to allow them to do that election coverage? Well, what do journalists always need? Resources. So we developed a number of programs from our fellowship program that paired journalism students and recent graduates with partner newsrooms, to our rapid response fund, which Joy and I have been working on, which we rolled out the day after the election. Through our funding, we're able to provide $200,000 worth in grants to newsrooms to support emergent election needs, to things like our resources, to things like a story and pitch database and an experts network. So you'll be receiving a link after the call to electionsos.org. I highly encourage you, if any of this sounds interesting to you, sign up for our newsletter. We're still sending out weekly election updates. But really what we learned is that by focusing on election coverage that prioritized that core component, surfacing what the community needs to know, it allowed the newsrooms who pursued this type of coverage to really hone in on where their efforts would be best spent. Honestly, we were expecting newsrooms to say, oh, the community told us new things through our listening that we didn't really know about. That didn't really happen. They're like, we did know that was important, but this has validated our approach to put resources here. And the other thing that newsrooms found is that when they had the community input already in hand, when they go to candidates, to politicians, to spokespeople, whoever, to ask these important questions, it really gave them a little more oomph and a little more power to their questions. So where we go from here, and I'm really looking forward to today's breakout session, is really applying what we learned from 2020 to the challenges in 2021. And I'm going to share exactly one slide today, because this is a slide that not only represents our past, but also our future. This is what happened in March of 2020. Give me a thumbs up if this sharing is working. Thank you. This is coming in through Hearken offers an engagement technology where people can submit usually questions to our partner news organizations. We'd never seen activity like this before, because engagement is highest in times of need. And I bet we can all think of a number of topics coming our way in 2021, whether it's the vaccine, whether it's the governmental policies that are going to be coming into effect as administrations change, where audiences are going to have lots of questions. And so newsrooms now can prepare for this surge in engagement by learning how they can invite those questions and then how best to respond in a way that builds audience relationships. So that's what I'll be talking about more today. Again, thank you for being here and for all the work that you've done. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nora from PEN America.
Thanks so much, Bridget. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and present. I am the director of US Free Expression Programs at PEN America. And this election season, we launched a national initiative called What to Expect to inoculate the public against what it seems at this point pretty consensus oriented opinion that we were up against dire and uniquely dire circumstances in 2020 amid a pandemic, civil unrest, and a very surreal election cycle. And so we worked in a number of ways that I'll walk you through. I will skip over some of the underpinning of our background and our research around disinformation, but we have long been concerned about the effect that disinformation poses around our elections and more broadly around public discourse. That slowly we have seen increased polarization, division, and discord, where communities are distanced from each other, where they distrust the news and local media ecosystems in their communities and cannot come together really with a sense of a shared vision of what we all believe in or want. And so knowing these things, we launched What to Expect When You're Electing to do a few things. Prepare people for what to expect, given the unique circumstances of the election, to inoculate members of the public against what we felt were really these very serious looming threats, where disinformation pervades our news feeds, our discussions with each other, and it's really hard for people to parse through what is accurate and credible and what is fake news or somehow a misleading narrative that, frankly, over the last several years, we have seen our own president sow doubt in people's trust around our electoral process and our institutions. And then we wanted to build awareness of the challenges for the media. And it's been really wonderful working with this coalition here. Amy, I have to give a big shout out to you because you were steering this ship and building the plane while all of us were flying individual planes. So it was a wild ride, but working with this coalition was really wonderful in being able to have a kind of sounding board to what local media and other organizations that were media advocates were hearing. Because PEN America works with both the media and with members of the public, I felt like it was really a unique opportunity to hear and have a kind of ear to these issues from the media, as well as then be able to put into practice what readers needed. And so we launched a series of actions. We organized national events with media leaders, both convening leaders from a range of outlets, as well as disinformation experts to lay out what the threats were this election season that media leaders and editors needed to be aware of. We also then brought together a series of standards desk editors with the AP, Fox News, and CNN later in October to really dive into what were the tough calls and the challenges that standards and decision desk editors would need to be making around the election and the calling of results, conveying that information then to the public to help them understand what to expect, what delays meant, and that delays were not an inherent sign or evidence of a rigged election or corruption. We also worked with the Washington Post Live on a partnership, a three-part series, which you can see here. We launched a public campaign, which was, let's say, the fun part. We got to do an interactive media literacy quiz for people. We developed a video PSA leaning on and featuring many of our PEN America luminaries. We called it Spot It, Check It, Stop It, and these ads were featured all over our social media channels. We launched an Instagram interview series with leading experts in disinformation and media. And you can see here that our What to Expect hashtag reached over 50 million impressions. The video campaign acquired over 1.25 million views and more impressions. Things I don't fully grasp, but I know that people were loving the fun stuff. We developed a series of bilingual publications that was all in furtherance of just providing information for the public around what to expect this election season. One of those, though, I have to give a shout out to this entire coalition because we developed a journalist guide on election coverage together That was the reporter's guide on covering the 2020 election, featuring expertise from literally everyone who has spoken here today. And it was a really tremendous group effort that then was shared over and over in our media communities. The heart of a lot of this work has been our disinformation defense training, and we trained over 35,000 members of the public with tools to spot and stop the spread of disinformation. We also then worked with what I call grass tops influencers, the people that we inherently trust in our communities. Maybe it's faith leaders or educators or librarians, community organizers, the people that we kind of go to on Twitter and we say, oh, well, they tweeted that, so I believe it. And so we trained over 1,000 faith leaders who then disseminated these tools to inoculate their constituents around the threats of disinformation. We also then worked with over 1,000 librarians to do similar issues in spreading these types of messaging in their programming with patrons. And then what we're here to talk about later in our breakout with Protect Democracy is the value of bringing media and readers together. We felt like at the core, we needed to, this election cycle, help people understand how the news gets made as a tool to fight against the distrust that people have in their local journalism and in news coverage writ large. And so we hosted a series of journalist convenings, bringing editors and journalists in local cities all over the country to talk about how they were going to be covering the election and to bring readers and voters together so that they could ask the essential questions, the things they were confused by, as Bridget has mentioned in the past, to urge reporters to just report on the process of what was going to be such a complicated and weird, surreal elections cycle. And the final thing I'll say is that we wanted to mobilize people around the country. And so we tried to bring in town halls, civil rights experts, election officials to round out the work that we saw in just providing people a place where they could ask the questions and feel like they knew some kind of answer to prepare them, not just for November 3rd, but the week that followed. And frankly, I'll just say in closing that, so much of the concerns that all of us as experts worried and prepared for, I think did not come to pass. The kind of massive or the scale of concern and unrest we anticipated and needed to gird against did not come to pass. And yet the threats that disinformation poses will long outlast November 3rd. And so our work and the urgency around preparing the public and pre-bunking the issues that we know are central to the way that we feel less connected, less engaged, and more distrustful in our communities, all of those issues will continue. And so we'll continue doing trainings and working with journalists and members of the public in communities all over. With that, I will turn it over to my wonderful colleague, John Steinman from Protect Democracy, and I will stop sharing my screen as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora. So grateful to be here on this panel with so many great friends. And Amy, thank you again, as Nora said, for bringing us all together and keeping us working throughout this very hard season. Not to put too fine a point on it, but our nation just survived a severe coronary, and a lot of it was driven by disinformation. And so grateful for all of the journalists who are here today and all those who are not here, who did a wonderful job preparing for the threats, who did an excellent job covering the issues, avoiding signal boosting misinformation, and trying to put context around lies that we heard in our political discourse. I work for Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit that was built to arrest our country's slide into authoritarianism and repair and rebuild our democracy. As Nora just said, the issues that we just survived this election season, they're not over. They're going to continue. Trump is not going to be president at 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, but he will still have a Twitter account. He will still be paid attention to by millions of Americans. And that's something that we all need to think about, considering only about a quarter of Republicans accept the election results from November. And that's in large part because of the disinformation that the president and his circle have been driving into our discourse. First Draft put together a wonderful little summary of what the president has been doing on Twitter just since November 7th through December 14th. November 7th is when the media projected Biden had won. From that time, he tweeted about 1,043 times, and a third of those tweets were labeled by Twitter. And nonetheless, the damage was done. Most Republicans do not accept the outcome of the election. There are still doubts across the political spectrum about what was and wasn't fraudulent. Disinformation is rampant, and we're still struggling to get ahead of the problem while we're remediating it in real time. It's extremely hard to get around. In addition to working with Protect Democracy, I staff the National Task Force on Election Crisis, which was more than 50 experts from across the political spectrum, folks like Michael Chertoff at DHS and Vinita Gupta at the Leadership Conference. We had public health experts, national security experts, election experts. And at the end of the day, despite the fact that the election system worked because a lot of people hustled very hard and journalists worked very hard to prepare for the threats, we're not out of the woods. As Nora said, these issues will continue. I just met with Twitter yesterday, and I came away knowing that Trump will still have a Twitter account on January 21st. They will not deplatform him right away. He will still have access to 88 million followers on that platform. He still has a right-wing echo chamber that follows everything he does. So we have a lot to prepare for and a lot to try and figure out a way around, because disinformation isn't just a problem that affects, neighbors and communities. It has deep implications for our democracy, and if we're not able to solve it, we're going to have a different form of government in the years ahead, the one that we didn't consent to. So I'm going to kick it back over to Joy now, another one of my great colleagues.
Thanks, John. Hi, I'm Joy Mayer from Trusting News, and this sure has been an interesting year. At Trusting News, we've been for almost 5 years now working with newsrooms to figure out what people think of the news and what people think of the news in general and what people think of your news. We kind of guide newsrooms through the process of figuring out what gets in the way of trust with your own audience. So boy, have we learned a lot this year. Two things we've learned, and then we're going to kick it off into some breakout sessions. Two things I want to share that we've learned. One is that when you pick the right topic to pull back the curtain and explain how journalism works, people are interested, both in why certain stories get covered and don't covered. Why are you picking this national AP story to put on the homepage of your local news site and not this one? Because people have all kinds of assumptions about why you picked one and not the other, and we don't really talk about that much. How you choose what to cover, the choices you make about sourcing, when you call elections. Boy, did the Associated Press learn a lot this year about how interested people are in that process, which is fantastic. Like, that's good for democracy, that people are interested in the process. Most people had no idea that the AP calls thousands of elections a year and has been doing this for like 170 years or something. I learned a lot about it, but those stories did really well. Audiences were interested. Not all audiences, not everybody cares, but people who care about being responsible consumers of information and responsible participants in democracy are interested in those decisions. So that was definitely true with COVID as well. Why are you reporting this data, not this data? We had we saw some newsrooms do some really great work around, here's the data that's available to us. That doesn't mean we have an agenda and we're hiding this data from you or skewing this to look a certain way. So we learned a lot about transparency and are excited going into next year to have a new set of examples and set of best practices around how you choose what to share about your processes, your motivations, your ethics, which people don't even know the journalists have, frankly, because we don't talk about them. We don't point to them. We don't highlight them. So that was the first thing. The second thing is a nice pivot from what John just said, which is that the divide in the media ecosystem is only growing, the partisan divide. And the Gallup asks people every year, how much trust do you have in the news that you consume, basically. And 90% of Republicans do not have at least a fair amount of trust in news. And that's a really big number. And so I think we are overdue as an industry for a better conversation about what that means. It is not only about the people who are in bad faith abandoning facts and purposefully spewing misinformation. That is not 90% of Republicans. It's easy to look at comment sections and say, man, they just want to call us fake news. Nothing we say is going to change their minds. There's no point. But I think, if our goal as journalists is to reflect the diversity of the communities we serve, and to sort of host conversations across divides, then from a democratic standpoint, we certainly need to be reaching more than 10% of people who lean right. And also just from a financial sustainability point in journalism, doing nothing about this seems like a bad choice. So our breakout session today, I'm here with my colleague Lynn Walsh, and our breakout session is gonna pose some questions around that.
I love seeing things repopulate. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys had a great breakout rooms. I can open it up to breakout room leaders first. If somebody wants to talk about something specific that you were like, we landed on this, and I think it would really be informative for the whole group to know. Joy was nodding, so maybe I'll volunteer Joy.
Sure. Yeah, on the topic of how journalists can connect with conservative news audiences who believe in consuming information responsibly and yet feel like the news is not made for them and doesn't reflect their values in their life. We had a really informative 30 minutes. I took a lot of notes. I think one thing that seemed to come up a lot is that the attitudes of journalists when we talk about this problem tend to be pretty dismissive. A lot of people were picturing going back to their own newsrooms and trying to have this conversation, and the responses include a lot of like, well, why should we pander to them, or they don't believe in facts anyway, so what's the point? And I think we let ourselves off the hook when we focus on the people who aren't persuadable that your news is credible, because they're always going to be there. But we've got to find a way to get over cultural hurdles and barriers, and just sort of our own understanding of how the world works, to have a better conversation about what it looks like to accurately reflect the experiences of conservative audiences, and for them to feel like our product is relevant to them and reflects their values and priorities as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Was there a participant in Joy's room who'd like to add on to that? I know Howard Hardy is here. He was one of our Wisconsin fellows, as is Sandra Fish, who was in Colorado. I don't know if any of that, Howard or Sandra, resonates with you, what Joy just said, the concerns around getting conservative voices without doing that both sidisms that journalists cannot stand, and many readers can't either. How about you, Sandra?
I think it's a challenge in that there's division among conservative voices, and you might talk to somebody or use as a source somebody who is conservative, but they're not, other people don't consider them the voice because they're, for instance, acknowledging the results of the election or whatever. I mean, we actually had primary elections in Colorado, in one part of the state in particular, where the primaries were basically the general election, and you had one set of very conservative people running against a different set of very conservative people, and it was very divisive and filled with money too. But it's a challenge.
Yeah. Karen, at the AP, how are you?
Sorry. Hi, I'm good. How are you, Amy?
Thanks. Just wondering how, if that's entered into the conversation at the Associated Press about, extending an olive branch to conservative voices or broadening perspectives in any way on news coverage, or if news editors there are like, nope, it's either news or it's not.
I mean, it's pretty much it's news or it's not, I would say. I mean, these are issues that we're constantly, I mean, this year, I think, really made us reflect a lot on our news coverage and, how to put out stories responsibly, but also really cover the news, and it was, crazy at times. So these are things that we've been talking about a lot, but it really does come down to the news value. What does it hold, and then figuring out the right way to kind of present that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anybody else from the topic of conservative voices or reaching out to the right to inform reporting?
This is Nora. I will just say I was not in, of course, Joy and Trusting News's breakout, but I wish I could have been split myself in half, because this one I think is a question that we at PEN America are also grappling with. And if I could just like underscore and put in bold italics underlined the question and the urgency around how we call people in, not call them out, I would. So I don't have the answer. I just sort of wanted to really underscore, and I'm grateful that we are thinking about it and you guys are really thinking about this.
Great.
Thank you. We can't abdicate. We can't just give up on this issue. It doesn't feel like it's too important. So I appreciate that.
Catherine from WBEZ in Chicago, one of my favorite public radio stations. Do you mind if I ask you if there's a conversation at WBEZ about reaching out to other audiences that you might not have had before?
Yeah, definitely. So we took the Citizens Agenda framework for elections coverage, and sort of our strategy for outreach was looking at communities that have been hardest hit by COVID, both in terms of health, so cases and death counts, but also economic impact. So we centered on like about 5 community areas and zip codes to do outreach to, and did a lot of sort of on the ground in-person outreach, since we didn't have a lot of long-term relationships with people in those areas. So one of the things we talked about in our breakout group is just how to kind of repurpose some of that outreach work we did around elections for some of the engagement work we're planning for vaccine coverage.
Do you have anything you can pregame with us, like how you'll approach the vaccine coverage?
I think we're going to probably take a similar framework. I'm actually having a conversation about that right after this meeting, but I think we're also going to look at communities that have been historically, or this year have been hardest hit by coronavirus, and maybe also have low trust in the vaccine as well.
Okay, great. Nora and John, your breakout room, any top lines from what was shared?
Sure. So we had a mix. Our breakout room is really to look at how can we think of the model from this election cycle in bringing journalists and the public together as one to replicate, and what were the lessons learned when we think about how journalists and the media maybe got things right, and then in places where they needed to be more reflective of readers' concerns and questions. And this really sparked a question for the group more writ large around what trust is, and how there is just so much deep-seated distrust of a variety of institutions, our public health institutions, our electoral process, and the news media, and that each of those as large buckets need to be addressed in tandem. And so I think I'd love to hear from some of those that were in our group, and with John as well, co-facilitating with me, but we really thought sort of what are the products and what are the ways that we can build faith back into those institutions.
Yeah. John, do you have anything to add?
No, that was really good. I think the only thing I can maybe add a little more detail is maybe build more resilience in the citizens of our country too. Citizens have obligations as well as freedoms, and some of those obligations mean taking part, involving yourself in your community, being informed. And these sometimes are challenges for people who don't know how to parse information in this current sort of like cacophonous media environment, in which most people access news not directly through professional media, but through their friends, through posts on social media. So I think building up literacy skills early on, whether that's something that we have to adjust curricula for in public schools or something else, but I think we do need to do sort of the remediation, but also sort of the resilience building at the other side.
Yeah. Great. Bridget, some top lines or things you want to kick out to the room?
Yeah, and Catherine was actually in my room. I think she reminded me of one of my metaphors that I think is relevant for all of our conversations today, which is the pizza stone, which is that every time you try one of these new efforts, it adds to the flavor overall. And so I would encourage everyone, as you're thinking about this, you know, we mentioned reporting on the process earlier, but I think it's important to look at all of these approaches to election and political coverage, not in terms of getting everything 100% correct right away and not doing it unless we know we're going to do, you know, the most amazing project that has ever been done. Just incorporate it in your reporting. It does not have to be this huge initiative, but it's something you can learn from over time and try out and test out in many different ways. We were speaking specifically around engagement around vaccines and looking at groups we could reach out to, as Catherine mentioned, and how we might be able to reach out to them. And the fact that there's just so many different ways to do that does not mean, oh no, we can't do this until we can do all of the ways. You have to look at it as a process and not like a news product. You have to look at it as something that you can try and continue trying and see the value in learning from failures, as well as celebrating successes. And so I'm hopeful that our conversations today can be moved forward simply by not setting a huge bar for how much needs to get done and just looking at what can be done right now and then building on that and making your pizzas ever more delicious.
Making me very hungry. Thank you.
And your news products ever more informed.
Anybody else want to jump in on that if you were in Bridget's room, or maybe you weren't and you have a question? Somebody has a question, Yamil. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I hope I did. You asked, are there differences in the qualms that conservatives have with their local outlet versus national news outlets?
Oh, yeah, I was just picking up from what Joy was mentioning about the AP and maybe some of the issues that headline that local outlets have to run cause for them. And I was, not to take us back to the previous breakout room, but I just wasn't in it and was very curious how geography might play a role in rebuilding trust efforts.
The thing I love most about your question is that it invites us to think about, to not put people in easy, oversimplified buckets. People have very different relationships with different types of news organizations, and geography plays a role, partisanship plays a role, size, and just sort of how news organizations orient. Like, you know, some organizations have, I don't know, there are a lot of ways that people feel about news organizations in general. So yeah, the quick answer is yes, there are differences, but the sort of fake news climate does trickle down, and local newsrooms need to be addressing this. Local newsrooms are letting themselves off the hook as well by saying, oh, that's like a cable news problem. That's not an us problem. But people don't know the difference. They don't even know where they're getting the news from half the time. They're not paying that close attention. And they just fundamentally aren't sure that we're part of the solution here, not part of the problem.
I think we've got a hole to dig out of, that's for sure, in the coming years. Deira, how did the first draft room go? What was the topic of conversations? Any good top lines to share?
Yeah, for sure. So the main issue when it comes to misinformation right now is vaccines. We all know that the election issues are going to boil into January and into February, but the long haul issue will be vaccine hesitancy, vaccine trust. And one of the bigger lines that came out of our discussion was understanding the nuance around why people may be, you know, vaccine hesitant versus anti-vax, and the difficulty that newsrooms have in understanding that the blanket term of we need to trust vaccines, we need to trust science does not work for every community that is having difficulty trusting what's coming from the government or what's coming from big pharmaceutical companies, what's coming from even community leaders, because unfortunately there is a more complicated information ecosystem now that when people go to their church or their community group, they may trust aspects of it, but maybe not everything if they think there's something else going on underneath. So it is some difficulty when it comes to explaining some of the details and nuance around vaccine trust. But I think one of the biggest takeaways that I got is we need to focus more on the history and the reasoning why some communities are more hesitant versus why are they anti-vax, because it's going to be real difficult trying to convince anti-vax folks or individuals who are more comfortable with holistic health approaches, cultural and traditional approaches to medicine and health, than it will be for folks who trust in science, who have no problem with science, but don't trust the powers that be who are telling them you need to do this.
Right. On our team, what we saw throughout 2020, this chipping away at institutions. You can't trust the post office. You can't trust the CDC. You can't trust the FDA. You can't trust all of these things. And so now we're expected to trust them. There was somebody from the Biden team saying, well, you can trust the FDA. And, you know, the person who was interviewing them did not push back. It's like people don't trust the FDA. And here's the reason, the historical reasons why. And so I think we need to interrogate it, that the vaccine just as much as we would any other topic, to account for the skepticism that's there, and not necessarily to push for, you know, one vaccine over another. Anybody else in terms of forecasting for these old misinformation, we call them zombie rumors that just won't go away? Any zombie rumor that you have a question about or saw in 2020 and wonder if it might make a comeback?
Hi, this is Maggie. I just think that the resurgence of pandemic 2, is really worrying, and the speed by which it is spreading. And even though it's been demoted on YouTube and other platforms, how it's popping up in alternate platforms that are less accessible to monitor. And also this pervasive, they're injecting microchips or nanotechnology along with the vaccine to track us. And fill in the blank, who's doing the tracking? Is it Bill Gates? Is it George Soros? Is it the government? You know, is it Big Pharma? Who's doing the tracking? You know, it's a malleable rumor that just keeps popping up in different forms. And also I see the China, blaming China, and China blaming outsiders for bringing it into China. Permutations of that keep popping up as well. So I imagine we're going to be facing all of those in depth in 2021.
Are you a reporter, Maggie, or with the newsroom?
I'm actually at the Google News Lab, and we do a lot of training around disinformation.
Great.
And so we're paying close attention to all of these things and how to refute them.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
But Google did just, I'll try to put a link in. I'm on my phone, which is harder. But Google did just add a hub for misinformation for researchers and for reporters. And I'll try to find that and add it in.
Great. Well, since I have you, what might you do for vaccine in terms of the right card? When somebody types in, you know, vaccine is a, you know, what might Google do to sort of build a defense on that?
So on all the platforms, in search and YouTube, the first thing that anybody sees when they type in anything having to do with coronavirus or the vaccines is a card that pops up with authoritative information. And it will link to WHO or CDC, you know, depending on where the person is searching from. So the authority or authoritative news sources, as well as official sources in their area. And they're also working very hard to demote, downgrade, downrank any sources of misinformation.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
John Hernandez, how was your breakout room? Any top lines you want to share with the room at large?
Yeah, so I think where we are is that we're kind of at the beginning of this conversation about exactly what reporting on civics and democracy can look like going forward. You know, we talked a little bit in our room about the assumptions and the habits and like the traditions that typically guide political reporting, and how we, you know, and how I mentioned in our presentation that this year created the conditions to throw a lot of that out. In our case, for our network, part of that was informed by conferring with experts in the election administration and misinformation world, who kind of offered a check and balance to our ability to prioritize certain narratives that like we usually do in the editorial process. And in the end, like, I'm wondering if that's a model to continue going forward to kind of inform some of our political reporting with people who are good at political communication and who understand this problem on a deeper level, so that we can create more pathways for people to engage with political reporting by understanding how these democratic and civic processes actually work. We highlighted some of that in some of the reports that we wrote, and I'd like to see more of it, because it seems to not only is it good to operate in service of democracy and civics, but obviously, like, it works when it works well. There was high engagement with these stories. There was some people saw this as a potential revenue stream, and in the end, it's not really so much, and we talked about this in the room as well, it's not really so much a replacement to political reporting as a complementary effort, as a sort of on-ramp to the world of politics that we kind of take for granted as journalists, because we live in the political world very deeply, and don't often consider how to lead with policy implications as opposed to political implications, because we live in the world of politics, not in the world of policy, a lot of the time. So again, we're still writing this as we go, and so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in 2021 for our network and for people that are interested in this. But I want to carry this forward, and I'm curious to hear if anyone else has any thoughts on that or took anything away from that part of the conversation.
Great. I just paused to read Brittany's chat message, which I think, Brittany, I'm not sure where you are on the call, but you kind of wrote down exactly how I'm feeling, which you said, I'm finding that I'm experiencing mental drain and having less patience to engage in these difficult conversations. I can retweet and co-sign that. Do you want to talk more about it? Because that is really part of the reason why we're here, is to talk about how it's been a hard year. It's been the hardest year ever, and we're expected to do more with less if you're in a newsroom. And the news cycle has not ended, not once this year. So please tell us more.
Sure. So I'm Brittany Schock. I'm the Engagement and Solutions Editor at Richland Source. We're in Mansfield, Ohio. Another deep red part of Ohio. I admit that I'm multitasking a little bit, because we're having that exact conversation in my newsroom right now with a reader who is conservative, who's upset with us for posting a press release saying that his business was cited for, following Governor DeWine's health orders, and how, F Richland Source and blah, blah, blah. And, and I can feel myself wanting to be like, well, you know what? He's not going to want to engage with us. This is a lost cause. I can feel myself saying, I don't want to reach out with him, because I just don't want to get in the argument and have to deal with this. And it's happened so much this year that I'm noticing it now, where it's difficult, that mental drain of just you have to give a lot of emotional energy to having these difficult conversations with people, on either side, people you don't agree with, people, just trying to get people to understand. And it's not easy. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, I think everyone's going through it. And I don't know the answer to it either, to where how to make it better, how to take care of yourself while also being patient and having these meaningful dialogues with people that you don't agree with, and or that you're trying to educate, and they're being stubborn about it. So I don't have the answer to it, but I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of it is personal too, for me, just feeling like, oh my God, I can't have one more difficult conversation. I'm exhausted.
Well, Amy, if I can jump in here real quick as a former reporter, I want to thank Brittany for what she's doing. It is hard work, and thank all of the other reporters out there who are just under unbelievable stress. I'm a former reporter. Amy's a former reporter. I was a young reporter in Florida in 2000 when that election crisis happened, and it was a nightmare. But I'm extremely aware that I didn't have to deal with Twitter and Facebook and the amount of division that we now have to deal with. So, you know, my heart goes out to you, and whatever we can do to help, you let us know. And there are a number of organizations on this call. Protect Democracy is just one of them. We want to help support the work that you do. So if there's different kinds of products we can be putting out, there's research that we can be doing, there's training and seminars that we can do to help bring, you know, people together so there's better understanding. We're all in this together, and I feel your pain, and it hurts to hear it, because I know you're not alone. So I think this is going to be another challenge we have to tackle going forward.
I just want to ask Joy if she has some input, because you, whether it's writing or on our Tuesday calls, you always give me a little pep talk. So I think we need some insight, Joy.
Oh, no pressure on the pep talk. It's kind of a depressing topic. The listening is such hard work, and you can't communicate properly if you're not also listening. And if all you're doing is defending yourself, then you're not listening, right? And so, like, Brittany, what you're basically talking about is whether you can summon the fortitude and mental energy to both, like, with a little bit of humility, but also striking a tone that is not afraid to defend your work, are willing to engage with somebody who's telling you that you're doing it wrong and that you're probably out to get him and sink his business or whatever, right? Let me say this about listening. One thing we talk a lot about at Trusting News is that there's a difference between effective trust and cognitive trust. And effective trust is like, do people think you have integrity? Do they think you're one of the good guys? Do they think that you're good for democracy, not bad for it? Do they trust your sort of values and purpose? And like, are you their kind of person? Cognitive trust is what journalists feel comfortable with. That's where we share all the facts about what makes us trustworthy. No. Look at our policies and look at our process and look at our sourcing and just stick with me through this explainer piece and 100% you'll trust me, right? No. They're not going to trust any of that. They're not going to trust your fact checks unless they trust the person doing the fact checking. And so that engagement and other ways, Facebook Live videos, like anything we can do to put a human touch and remind that it's human beings who live in your community making the decisions, anything we can do with that pays dividends for the rest of the transparency efforts. Because if people fundamentally don't think we're good people, or that people who work in newsrooms are good people, that is a big burden to overcome. And so I think the engagement is really important. And it's also important to figure out when people deserve your time and energy, and how you can do that in a way that scales so that you're not spending all of your time talking to people who hate you. I think there are a lot of ways we need to be talking more about how to engage efficiently and how to engage persuasively, because a lot of what newsrooms do to try to defend their work doesn't actually move the needle with people who just fundamentally don't think they're good people. I don't know if that was a pep talk though, Amy.
No, I think it's great. I saw Brittany nodding a lot, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. You know, when we were coming together to say, well, what would this event be about? I'm like, I'm not quite sure. I just feel like we need to come together at the end of the year. But Brittany, your comment is the single biggest reason why I thought we should come together, because we all needed this collective exhale and a pat on the back to, like, we did it. Like, we covered this election effectively. And if we play our cards right, we will cover this vaccination and pandemic in the same skillful way in 2021. I just want to see if anybody else has another comment before we close out, because I like to stick my landing. We got 2 minutes. Anybody? Well, we are all available. We will follow up with an email with ways that you can engage with each one of our organizations or with us directly. You guys, if you were a journalist on the ground, thank you so much for the work that you did this year. If you were on a platform and helped curtail problematic content from rising up, thank you for your work. And everybody else, have a great end of this endless year. It will end, but it just feels endless right now. And we will see you all back in 2021 on how we can work together and stay engaged and support each other throughout the coming year. Thank you very much, everyone. See you.